hip these days. I just consulted ChatGPT and asked it to write me an introduction for our congressman, and it wrote me about a 5-page intro. And so then I asked it to do it short, make it shorter, and then I asked it to make it shorter again. But before I do that, I'm going to put Scott on point here and ask you to repeat part of your blessing because Jim missed it, and he needs to hear it. Because it's good.
Oh my Perfect timing. Jim, I did invoke a prayer of blessing for you and all of our elected officials, that you would have energy and intelligence and imagination and love as you render your service for the people of this great nation. And I would have added, if you were here, and you are here, so I would add to remember your highest calling is to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with our God. Bless you.
Perfect.
Amen.
Well done.
Thanks, Leo.
I'm sure it'll be payback. But I'm honored to introduce our Congressman Jim Himes, who's currently serving his 8th term representing Connecticut's 4th District since 2009, if it has it correct. While Jim needs no introduction, I'll share a few quick facts. He was born in Lima, Peru, graduated from Harvard, and studied as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, all of which has shaped his global outlook. His commitment to public service is evident from his work in affordable housing to his role in finance. As current ranking member of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, he brings a wealth of knowledge to the table. Please join me in welcoming Jim.
Well, thank you, Leo, for that kind introduction, and thank you, everybody. It's a delight to be with the New Canaan Rotary Club. Thank you so much for that blessing. Micah 6:8 is actually probably my favorite line in the entire Bible. So thank you for that. It's really a delight to be with the Rotary. I appreciate the incredible works that you do. The 4-part test. I sometimes chuckle to myself. The 4-part test in Congress. We're pretty good if we can get one of those 4 on any given activity. So it's wonderful to see an organization devoted to more than one of those. What I thought I might do is maybe just take 15-ish minutes to talk a little bit about our politics, because we're in a very polarized moment right now. And I've done a lot of thinking about why that is. It started some time ago, probably when I first got involved in politics, and it maybe culminated on January 6th when the attack on the Capitol occurred. I was actually one of the last people out of the chamber that day, and I got a pretty good look at what was going on. And what struck me about that day was maybe not quite what you would. There were a lot of things that struck me: the fact that the security was so bad, the fact that it happened, etc. But what for purposes of this discussion, what struck me about that day was, I got a pretty close look at those folks that, broke windows and went after police officers and, did what they did to the Capitol. And what was remarkable to me was, there were some very bad people involved. There were Proud Boys and others who I think were attracted by the idea of violence. But what continues to stick with me is that I saw a lot of these folks. And we would be making a mistake by saying that these were all bad folks. These were people that I think you would meet at the supermarket or in church or anywhere else, who in the context of our politics got shaped into something that I suspect even today most of them find unrecognizable. Yes, it was election lies and all of that stuff, but as a human phenomenon, what happens to get otherwise decent Americans into that frame of mind? It's impossible for me not to view things through a partisan lens, but I'll try to be as unpartisan as possible. I'll criticize both left and right in this country in the process of laying out my thinking and learning on this. So anyway, I did a lot of thinking about what has gotten us to a place where a significant portion of Americans have sort of given up on the traditional, gentle, respectful, civil politics that we all grew up with. Now, we have rosy historical glasses, and I remind people that, those of you who remember the late 60s and early 70s, Kent State, the tearing apart of the country over Vietnam, the violence and arguments associated with the civil rights movement. It's a mistake to think that we were ever an idyllic completely civil nation. But we're obviously back to a point of mutual suspicion and mutual fear and polarization without a Vietnam War, without a civil rights movement to drive it. And so what drives it? And I'll try to be brief, but I would submit to you that it's maybe three things, and I'll just spend a minute or two on each. Number one, a lot of economic change in this country that we don't see in Fairfield County. And I want to spend a minute or two on that because I think it's really important. A lot of social change that most of us would say is good, but has led to a lot of dislocation on the part of a lot of, in particular, more conservative Americans. And by the way, when I say conservative, I don't mean Republican. I mean, blue collar, working class folks in Pittsburgh are pretty conservative, traditional Democrats. And then third, social media. I'm a natural skeptic of the idea that there are new things in this world. Oftentimes things that we see are things that we've dealt with in history before. I actually think social media is an exception to that, and I'll spend a minute or two on that. And then at the end, I owe you a quick discussion of what I'm focused on as your representative. But I'll leave the bulk of the time for your questions, so we can talk about what you want to talk about. Okay, so our polarization. It was not lost on me, as I'm sure it was not lost on you, that the premise of Trump's campaign actually looked a fair amount like the premise of Bernie Sanders' campaign. Both articulated that the system is rigged against you, and that the pain you feel, the loss, the anger, is somebody else's fault. Now, in Bernie's telling, that was corporations and Wall Street and business, whatever. In Trump's telling, it was largely immigrants. It is a mistake to dismiss that. And it's easy to dismiss that if you live in Fairfield County or on the coasts. Tim Ryan of Ohio, who very, very briefly ran for president, he was a colleague of mine, represented Youngstown, Ohio. And we would have a lot of conversations about this. And Tim and I would sit on the benches there in the House of Representatives, and he would constantly sort of tell me what it's like in Youngstown, Ohio. And he had all these aphorisms like, he would say, Jimmy, your people shower before work, my people shower after work. He had these constant things about the difference between our communities. But the story he told was one that I think is not just Youngstown, but it's actually vast swaths of the Midwest, the post-industrial Midwest, and actually not just the post-industrial Midwest, but the Pequannock Valley, the Housatonic Valley. Go see Oxford and Shelton and Derby and look at those empty mills. And what Tim would say was, Youngstown, Ohio, a generation ago. I've never been there, but he says, up on the hill where the big, beautiful Victorians that the plant managers and everybody lived in, and everybody in Youngstown had a good middle-class job. They were probably union members, they had health care. They weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but they had a good, solid job. They knew their retirement was going to be secure. They had the money to send their kids to college, probably had a car or two, no wealth, but maybe a week's vacation up on the lake or whatever. And he just said, that is all gone, all gone. The grandson of that guy, back that generation, it would have been all guys working in the mills and the plants, is working for $9 an hour at the Walgreens. No benefits, not able to pay rent, and that is why those Victorians up on the hill are now empty. And in fact, they're drug dens, and people are dying deaths of despair because of that radical 1 or 2 generational change in the economic prospects of an awful lot of Americans. And again, it's not just the Midwest. I do represent Shelton, Connecticut, which used to be, Bridgeport, Connecticut, it was known as the Arsenal of Democracy in World War I, because in Bridgeport, Connecticut, we produced more weapons and munitions for the Allies in World War I than any other locality. And now, of course, Bridgeport is bereft largely of industry. So there's this economic change, and that is very, very painful. And something that maybe in New Canaan, Greenwich, where I live, Westport, whatever, we don't appreciate how much that is painful for people to feel like they are moving backwards economically. And it is therefore a mistake, I would submit to you, to say that, for example, that MAGA is primarily driven by racism. There's some racist folks who I think glom onto that, but here's why I say that. There are counties after counties in the Midwest that voted plus 8, 9, 10 points for Barack Obama in 2008, who today vote +8, 9, 10 points for Donald Trump. Same voting population. And what that population has done over time is just look for change. They believed that Barack Obama was going to bring change. He was change, right? Relative to the Clinton legacy, he represented change. Donald Trump certainly represents change, whether you like it or not. Donald Trump is all about turning over the apple cart. So that's point one. Then there's my second category of social and other change that I think has dislocated and angered people. This has not been a good 20 or 30 years for the establishment, however you want to define it. I will never forget in 2008, right before I was elected, many of you will remember this, the economy was on its knees. People were losing their homes. And by the way, not just lower income people, managing directors in Bear Stearns were losing their homes. Americans saw a $17 trillion decrease in wealth. And in this room, there are people who understand exactly what happened, right? Collateralized mortgage obligations and everything. Most Americans thought this. Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, my former firm, Merrill Lynch, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers. I don't quite know what they do, but these people make an immense amount of money, and they've destroyed the economy. And my retirement is gone. My pension is now belly up. And then, to make matters worse, what does the government do? Thank God I wasn't in Congress at the time, but in late 2008, the government bails these firms out. So what do Americans see? And by the way, I saw this here, so you can imagine what it was like in Western Pennsylvania. What Americans see then is, wait a minute, these partners at Goldman Sachs, at Merrill Lynch, and everything, they brought down the economy in ways I don't fully understand, and then the government bailed their firms out. Where's my bailout for the mortgage that I can no longer pay? So I remember the moment when it happened. It was on I guess CNBC when a journalist articulated this. There was no help for you. The Wall Street firms. Anyway, you get my point. This is further adding to the rage. Then you've got social change. Now I'll stand here and tell you I think it's a wonderful thing that this generation has continued the progress that we've made in 2.5 centuries in this country of bringing more and more people into the full, blessings of liberty, as the founder said. We've been on a 250-year path with respect to African Americans. Immigrants have always had a rough time. Women are making strides. There's more women in the House of Representatives today than ever before. The Supreme Court, in the Obergefell decision, said that people who love each other of the same sex have a right to be married. I actually think this is all a good thing, consistent with what this country has done over 250 years, but it's dislocating for people. I've got elderly conservative Catholics in Stamford, Connecticut, who I've had conversations with because they deeply oppose gay marriage. And they're not bad people. They just, I grew up with this understanding. My Bible says this, and I don't side with that line of thinking, but I do know that when my party looks at that conservative Catholic in Stamford and says, you're a bigot, at a minimum, we're never getting that guy's vote again. And it also doesn't feel terribly charitable to me. And Barack Obama actually made this point when he was president. He said, we have a tendency on the left to be pompous and self-righteous about people who are not as far along on their social journey as maybe others are. And that's a very potent political force. But anyway, that has an impact on our politics, and immigration in particular. I should spend a minute on immigration, because if you look at the rise of the right around the world, whether it's in Italy or Greece or Spain, the UK is the one European country which is probably going to swing left in the next year or so on July 4th. But anyway, a lot of that is waves of migration changing the look and feel of communities. And here in the U.S., we're a nation of immigrants. We've never been easy on our immigrants. My Irish forebears in the 1890s had a really rough time. There was immense amounts of bigotry against them, and that's been the story in this country for a very long time. That you get here a generation or two, and then you start being angry at the latest wave of immigrants to the United States. But the point is, it's roiling the politics, and when somebody like Donald Trump can say to people who are feeling nervous economically, dislocated socially, that this is largely the fault of criminals who are coming across our southern border, we can talk more about actual immigration policy if you like, but my point is that that's a politically very powerful statement that resonates with people, because it's just a lot easier to blame somebody else for your problems than to say, what do we really need to do in post-industrial communities, et cetera. Last thing, social media. Again, I'm a real skeptic that things are different, but I think social media is different. And you all know this, but we all, looking around here at the average age in the room, we all grew up with 3 channels of television, right? ABC, CBS, and NBC. They all had some version of Dan Rather, some kind of slightly boring centrist white guy reading the news, right? And we all watched those 3 channels. And, you might have agreed with that boring white guy or not, but, Dan Rather and all those guys sort of tried to pitch it down the middle. Now, of course, we have 500 channels, and worse yet, we've got these things. And instead of us collectively watching the information from 3 different Dan Rathers, we are now putting ourselves in these little tiny alleyways that happen to correspond perfectly with our predispositions, and we just absorb news and information, not so much as critical thinking citizens, but as entertainment, as hobby. Oh my God, Rachel Maddow, she's so smart, and I hate Sean Hannity, or Sean Hannity's the, so we've given up this communal absorption of information in favor of what is frankly entertainment, I think. It's the scratching of your political predispositions. And worse yet, the platforms have come to understand that while cat videos and cute rabbits are one thing, if you really want to keep somebody doom scrolling, you're going to make them angry. This is what keeps people on Facebook and Instagram, is getting angry. There's a saying in politics that somebody will walk a mile to vote for you, they'll walk 10 miles to vote against you, which I think illustrates, the power of negativism. And the platforms have figured this out, and a lot of those people that I unfortunately met on January 6th, I think, were victims of this. They really believed a lot of what was coming across on Instagram, about the election being stolen, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that is a very, very big deal. So last thing, what can we do about this? I don't want to just lay out the problem. I want to talk about maybe what we can do about it. And at the end of the day, frankly, my answer comes down to all of you. I think there's structural things we can do to our politics. We shouldn't have closed primaries in this country. If you think about what happens in a primary, your most activist party members vote for who their candidate will be. Dare I say, normal people who don't spend all of their time in politics probably don't vote in primaries. It's people who are really, really fired up. And as a consequence, the Democratic candidates, the Republican candidates tend to be selected by their most activist bases, and they're the ones who go on to run in the general, which means that you're elevating people who appeal to the extremes. You're also creating a great deal of tension on somebody like me. Now, I'm very lucky. I represent, it hasn't acted this way lately for a bunch of reasons, but I represent a very moderate population that was traditionally Republican, today votes very Democratic. Anyway, my point is it's very moderate. But if I'm really fearing an attack in a primary, and I want to keep my job, I'm going to start sidling in that direction. So even those of us who don't typically face really challenging primary races get pushed left and right towards the extremes. So that's one example. I can talk about ranked choice voting and other things that I think empower the center, and depower the extremes. But at the end of the day, I really think we collectively have to solve this. People are always like, "You're the government. What are you going to do about social media?" First of all, we have a First Amendment in this country. So you know what we're going to do about social media? Not a lot. Not a lot. We are not going to get into the business of saying, some federal department saying this is information, this is misinformation, we are not going to do that. By the way, I'm kind of a First Amendment absolutist, so I would aggressively argue against the government trying to tell the American citizenry what good information is. I voted against, by the way, this shocked a lot of people, but I voted against the TikTok ban. Not because I don't appreciate what TikTok could be were the Chinese Communist Party to try to use it to manipulate Americans, but because I would rather get out of this business than acquiesce to the idea that the federal government is going to tell all of you what media outlets you have a right to read. I'm not going down that path. And so anyway, I broke a lot of glass by doing that. But anyway, we need to collectively decide that being a citizen is something more than entertainment. that is something more than scratching the itch of our pre-existing political beliefs. I'm here to tell you that, first of all this stuff I do in Washington is pretty hard. It is. If problems are easy to solve, they don't often rise to the attention of the Congress of the United States or the President of the United States. So, should we spend more money on Social Security? Maybe so. But if we do, we're going to have less money to spend on defense, or we're going to run bigger deficits. All these things are hard. And the ultimately ironic thing about American politics is that we actually play politics in this country between the 40-yard line and the 60-yard line. Go to the UK. In the UK, the government owns the entire healthcare system through the National Health Service, right? AOC and the fondest dreams of the left don't believe that we should go there. They believe that, we should have single-payer healthcare. And again, there's a few exceptions to these rules, but on the right, my Republican friends would like to cut taxes. The corporate tax rate, they'd probably cut, they succeeded in getting it down to 20% or 21%, but they're not saying cut it to 0%. Anyway, my point is that our politics are largely played between the 40 and 60-yard line. The stakes are not that low. So we as citizens have sort of got to accept that and stop thinking that, if a Republican is elected senator or Democrat, that it is apocalyptic for our country. The stakes are not that high. We have a resilient democracy and we have a good citizenry that needs to step up and be a little bit more critical, a little bit more skeptical about what they see on social media. I always say, if you're doom scrolling, as I do, unfortunately, as you're doom scrolling and you're getting more and more angry, somebody's manipulating you. Somebody is. Because on most issues, the stakes are just not that high. And I have a role to play. I hope I'm doing this now. I try to speak in such a way that is not, condemning of people that I disagree with. And look, Americans need to start electing people who aren't entertainers. But who understand that, like it or not, we're in a governing system that requires immense amounts of compromise and very, very slow-moving. We have a filibuster in the Senate. We have a bicameral legislature. We've spread out powers in this country over 3 levels of government and 3 branches of the federal government. So, if you can't be comfortable with incremental change and compromise, God bless you, but don't go to Congress, because that's what the software says. Last thing I'm going to say on this topic. Interestingly, there appear to be some self-correcting mechanisms. I'm just observing this right now, and we'll have the answer in a week. But arguably, from a political spectrum point of view, so by political spectrum, I'm saying, are you way out there on the left or way out there on the right? I'm not talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene. I have no idea where she is on the political spectrum. She's a social media personality, or Matt Gaetz. But arguably, the extremes in the place that I work are defined by the chairman of the Freedom Caucus, Bob Good, of Virginia, and a member of the squad, Jamal Bowman. Now, interestingly, if you asked me to put a $100 bet right now, I would tell you that the only 2 members of Congress who are going to lose their seats in primaries are going to be Bob Good and Jamal Bowman. Interesting. I could be wrong, but that seems to be where the numbers are trending. Okay. There's the big thing, politics. What am I spending locally? Candidly, locally, you might see me, I get asked to show up on TV a lot because I'm the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, and as you might imagine, with Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine, and Taiwan, China, that's a subject of real interest. Here, and when I think about serving the district, issues number 1, 2, and 3 for me are infrastructure. And by the way, housing, which is in some ways very closely related to infrastructure. I visit companies large and small, all over Fairfield County, and what's interesting is when you do that and you talk to business leaders, Republicans and Democrats, it's not the traditional left-right fight that comes up, my taxes are too high, regulations, we need a minimum wage. Without exception, business leaders large and small in this area say, this is a magnificent place to be, the schools are good, the lifestyle's as good as it gets, and I just can't get my employees into the office in the morning or get them home in the evening. And that, of course, is partly driven by a really inadequate housing stock. If you are a teacher in New Canaan and you certainly can't afford to buy a home here, you buy a home in Brantford, and now you are spending an hour plus getting here.
Federal government doesn't have a lot of levers on housing, and what we have in this country is a dramatic undersupply. And there's lots of ways to address that. Stanford is actually addressing that in Fairfield County right now. If you go to Stanford, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of units being built. And even smaller communities like Darien and to a lesser extent New Canaan are building, appropriately for the size of the town, are building housing in those towns. But on infrastructure, we have a very big role to play. Most of the money that goes to improve Connecticut's infrastructure is federal. And so, I not only am working very hard to get the funds to rebuild our railroad bridges and build more parking at train stations and that sort of thing, but am on a little bit of a crusade right now because we're just building too slowly. This bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed 2.5 years ago, is only now getting into actually shovels in the ground. And the problem here in Fairfield County is so urgent that we just can't have, a small bridge take 8 years to rebuild. That A, is bad for the area, and B, if you believe that government can actually do some good things, you got to be able to demonstrate that government can do some good things. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is to really move fast on our infrastructure. I'll anticipate 2 questions, and then I'm gonna be quiet for the remaining 20 minutes. Ukraine, Russia. I'm an ardent supporter of aid to Ukraine, and the reason for that is history teaches us that when you allow totalitarian dictators to gain a little by illegal actions, they will not stop, they will continue, and as we learned in World War II and in any number of other places, it's good to stop this early, and we're stopping it. We're at least stopping it. We're not winning the war, but we're stopping it without any American boots on the ground, with dollars that represent sort of 9% of our overall annual defense spending. And I'm also very conscious about what President Xi of China is seeing when he sees the U.S. and the West, generally Europe, react to an invasion, because as we know, he may be thinking of one of his own in Taiwan. Israel, Gaza, very quickly, and I'm happy to elaborate more, but I do want to shut up. I don't think I've encountered a global challenge that has caused as much emotion and rage and anger and political noise as Israel, Gaza. And I'll just tell you, I'm just say it very clearly. On the one hand, like all of you, I saw what happened to Israel on October 7th, and it was absolutely appalling. And Israel has every right to defend itself and to make sure that it is never in a position again where it would be vulnerable to that kind of attack. That has to do with eliminating Hamas, which is more complicated than simply eliminating Hamas. It also has to do, quite frankly, with a little bit of soul searching on the part of the Israelis about how that was allowed to, from an intelligence standpoint, develop. I feel very strongly that Israel has a right to defend itself. I also, and I don't miss an opportunity to say this when I meet with the Israeli ambassador or others, 2 things need to be different inside the Israeli government. Number one, they've got to fight this fight with a more serious commitment to humanitarian aid arriving to the Palestinians, and with a more careful approach to preserving civilian life. And then number 2, and this is really sort of a little bit heartbreaking, the Prime Minister refuses to do this, but Hamas at the end of the day is a bunch of fascists, terrorists with guns, but they're also an idea. And even if you eliminate those guys with guns, as we've learned all around the world, guys with guns are only part of your problem if there's an idea underlying this. And I hope that the Israeli government will begin to articulate a vision for 7 million Palestinians who, if there is no vision, will be that much more tempted to pick up a gun. So anyway, that's my view of those 2 things. Those are headlines only. But let me shut up, and happy to take your questions on any topic. Yes, ma'am?
Are we getting any closer to finding a viable third party in U.S. politics?
No, we're not. We're not. Our structure, I've thought about that. Every once in a while when either the other party or my party really irritates me, I sort of do a little research on this. And, the high water mark for third parties, because it's so hard for a third party to get on the ballot, seems to have been Ross Perot, who I think got 17%-ish of the national vote back in 90 or whenever he ran. We also have a first past the post system. So, one person is elected to the legislature, one person is elected to the White House. In systems where you have more proportional representation, my last election was 60-40 in my favor. If we just take that little group of people, in a proportional representation with a bigger legislature, you might send 2 Democrats to the House and 1 Republican to reflect that 60-40 split. roughly speaking. But no is the quick answer to that question. Our system doesn't really allow for it. Yes, sir.
Jim, you mentioned Bridgeport, so I've lived here since '88. I was in Stamford yesterday. You know this better than I. The transformation over the past decade, I guess, and it's ongoing. If you look at all those cranes and construction, is quite incredible. So, I mean, Bridgeport can never be the next Stamford location in relation to New York City and various other factors. But what would it take to get some sort of revitalization of Bridgeport so it's, I don't know, 30% of what Stamford is today, or 40%, or something? I'm sure you think about this a lot, but it's sad. And what would it take?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's one I think a lot about. I mean, I represent 17 towns and cities, and a lot of those towns and cities, don't need a lot of help from this being one of them. In fact, a number of the towns and cities would love to just not have to deal with the federal government. But Bridgeport needs a lot of help, and so it's been a huge amount of my time and energy. And there is a pretty significant difference between Stamford and Bridgeport, which is that Stamford is easily commutable to New York, and that's just something that you can't fix. Now, Bridgeport also has advantages. It's the only deep water port in Connecticut other than New Haven and I guess New London. But it suffered the typical decline associated with industry leaving and the vicious circle that happens where crime goes up. And I think my own view is that it has been exacerbated by, to put it nicely, really messy politics. I mean, we've had the voting scandals up there. The mayor, who I work with, and I believe he has repented, spent 7 years in federal prison, and I just make that point not to score a point, but just to say investors, others look at that and say it's just so hard to do anything there. The good news is, and I think this will drive the change in Bridgeport. Tyler back there, by the way, is involved in Bridgeport politics, and there is a new generation of younger Bridgeport citizens rising up, against the traditional way of doing politics. But I also think it's going to be, to some extent, a kind of Brooklyn model. If you remember Brooklyn 40 years ago, neighborhoods in Brooklyn were, some of them, Brooklyn Heights was fine, but some of those neighborhoods you wouldn't move into. And we have such a need for housing that I believe that the remarkable amount of land that is available in Bridgeport will get redeveloped into housing that will serve the rest of the country. We're not quite at the tipping point yet. There's 400, is that right, Tyler, 400? There's 400 market rate units going in on the coastline, so we're starting to see the building that is going to bring in professionals who will demand higher levels of service, will demand more of their political system, and I think it will progress. I just want it to progress a lot faster than it is. Yes, sir.
Last time I asked the question, it was a bit way before COVID, what's it going to take to get high-speed rail, since you are interested in infrastructure? Now we've passed an infrastructure act, put billions of dollars toward it, but you did talk about the political challenge of getting 3 states or more states all working together. Are we making any progress with high-speed rail and other major infrastructure projects?
Yeah. So I would hesitate to sort of answer the question around high-speed rail. Like, California has a high-speed rail. It's been a disaster, by the way, but California has a high-speed rail project underway where you can go Los Angeles to San Francisco through the interior. The ambitions in Connecticut are not, trains that move 180 miles an hour for 40 miles at a stretch. The ambitions are, I'll forget the governor's numbers, but the ambitions are basically to take 15 minutes or so off the New Haven to Stanford jump and about 15 minutes off the Stanford to New York jump. And that is achievable. And the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was bipartisan, will make the billions necessary to do that available. Is it going to happen tomorrow? No, it's not. But projects right now, if you go down to Norwalk, you'll see the Walk Bridge being reconstructed and do a 21st century bridge that will not break down the way it always used to do in the summertime in particular. So you're going to start to see the mechanical elements of a much faster train service come into place in the next 5 years. The Hudson River Tunnel is under construction right now, famously stopped by Chris Christie, whatever it was, 12 years ago or so. Now it's underway. So that backup that when you leave Penn Station on your way to Philly or DC, that backup will be gone. So again, it's not going to be home runs of like, here's our shiny new bullet train. It's going to be singles and doubles that ultimately make for a much more user-friendly experience. And it's also pretty unsexy stuff. I don't know what the situation is at the new Canaan station, but most towns have a 1-year waiting list for parking at their train stations. COVID alleviated that somewhat, but as people get back to it, we're going to need to do boring stuff like build more parking around train stations in our towns. Yes, sir.
Infrastructure, you said that it's going too slow. What would you say is it slowing it down? Is it bureaucracy? Is it lack of ability to get workers? What is keeping the bridge taking 8 years to build? Versus
All of the above.
Okay.
All of the above. So we have a system that has a lot of money in it and not enough engineers. Frankly, not enough laborers. The guys who are actually helping pour concrete. So, we have this massive investment of funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we just don't have the personnel to actually implement them. Now that'll begin to change, and the market will work in that regard. You may be surprised to hear a Democrat say this, but we have also, over the last 2 generations, built a regulatory structure around the construction of new things that is strangling our ability to build stuff. And it's not even the regulation. So, for example, the Environmental Protection Law just says, hey, you gotta do a study of the environmental impact of building a new train line. Fine, we should do an environmental study. But what has happened is that people are now litigating. And they're not litigating that the new train line is going to be bad for the environment. They're litigating that you didn't do enough community meetings, that you didn't do enough, consideration of some frog that lives out, whatever it is. And so there's an immense amount of litigation that has caused government everywhere to be very cautious and very slow about proceeding. Look, I think it wasn't lost on any of us that Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, when that bridge, that 95, when the tanker burned it down, thing got rebuilt in 2 weeks, right? And we're not going to achieve that kind of speed, but that just shows what's possible when people are really committed to it. And I don't know that neighborhood of South Philly all that well, but I'm pretty sure there aren't snail darters or other, terribly important environmental interests in a deeply urban society. So yes, it's bureaucracy. It's a lack of the people who know how to do it. It is to some extent regulation and supply chains. Supply chains are getting much better, but it's still not super easy to get all of the steel that we need to build what we want to build. Yeah. Why don't I go with these 2 gentlemen?
Great.
Please.
I would just say that I'm very concerned about the low approval rating that the president is getting. I think he's a very fine man doing the most difficult job in the world, very courageously. I can imagine what it's like to be his age, because I am his age, exactly. And I think it's astounding what he's doing, but I do think that the leadership of the Democratic Party needs to be out there telling everybody what a good job he's doing and what a difficult job. Otherwise, I think we may get his opponent in the White House, which would be, in my opinion, a disaster. So please speak up for the president.
Yeah, they spend too much time bashing Trump instead of talking about what they're good at.
Yeah. So I'm not gonna take this in a partisan direction, because I try very hard not to do that when I know that there are people of all parties in the room. But there's a heck of a debate going on inside his campaign about, do we make it all about Trump? Should we make it about the infrastructure law? Should we make it about Roe v. Wade and Dobbs and everything? And I'm just trying to do my job.
Yeah. He's doing a good job. He's a good job.
You spoke earlier, Congressman, about the reasons why we have extremism sort of controlling the 2 parties. Another cause, I think, is gerrymandering, the way districts are drawn. I don't know how we get out of that box, but I'd be interested in your comments on where we are and what the solutions might be.
Yeah, no, good point. And then why don't I finish off? I think you want to end at 1:30, right? So why don't I'll answer that question, then you can be the last. Okay, so yes, gerrymandering, absolutely right. If you look at some congressional districts, not here in Connecticut where they're basically squares, if you look at some congressional districts, I mean, they look like snakes, and that's designed not coincidentally by state legislatures to try to create partisan districts. The good news there is that a lot of states are doing away with the partisan drawing of districts. So, for example, in California, there's a nonpartisan commission which draws those lines. They've taken it out of the hands of the smoke-filled rooms in the legislature and created these commissions. And that has lowered the incidence of gerrymandering. You do have something a little more ominous, though, which is that Americans are choosing to live amongst folks that are politically like them. And I think that this is all part of this polarization. If you look at the numbers, there's polls out there that say, would you be comfortable with your daughter or your son marrying somebody of the opposite party? Americans used to not care. Now they care. And I mean, even numbers like, do you think that violence is ever okay in politics? That number used to be close to 0. Now it's, in the high 30s. And so people are, it's one thing how you draw the line, but then it's a lot about how people actually behave. So yes, we should do away with gerrymandering. Ranked choice voting helps with this too. I'm not gonna get into ranked choice voting, but ranked choice voting is a mechanism whereby if you want to vote for Ron Paul, God bless you, vote for Ron Paul. He's not gonna win, but then you can cast a second vote that in the second round would add probably to somebody more moderate. That's one example. But anyway, ranked choice voting and doing away with gerrymandering would really help.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask if you saw any hope for enforcing ethics rules with the Supreme Court.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, I hope so. No, I have two ambitions for the Supreme Court. Conscious as I am that there is a separation of powers, and of course it is the separation of powers that causes the Supreme Court to say Congress does not have the right to impose an ethics. I'm not sure that that's right. I'm not a lawyer. There are lawyers who say that there's plenty of precedent for Congress to pass a ethics code. We certainly pass an ethics code for ourselves and for the executive. It's crazy. I'm not going to name justices, but accepting huge amounts of travel. I can't basically accept gifts from people that aren't friends and stuff. But anyway, so yes, there is a robust debate about how that happens. In the very near term, I think it's going to happen when John Roberts finally realizes that his legacy will be wrapped up in taking a much firmer hand. John Roberts, the Chief Justice right now, says that this is all discretionary. Individual justices, I have no authority over them. I think he could take a more hardline approach and say, we are going to voluntarily agree to adopt a code of ethics that maybe looks like the code of ethics that I have to abide by. And then the other ambition I have for the Supreme Court, I got this question a lot. I'm really not a fan of trying to work out your anger at the Supreme Court by changing the number of justices. There were any number of people in my own party who, add 12 justices, and no. Let's not. It's been done historically, but let's not get into that game. What I'd really like to see, and I forget exactly how the math works, but I'd like to see an 18-year term for Supreme Court justices, 9 justices, and I think that works out that every president in one 4-year term gets to appoint 1 justice. That way you're not playing this bizarre actuarial roulette where who's going to die when or retire and everything. So to me, I'd love to see that happen. That would better, as it happened, Barack Obama in 8 years got to appoint 1 justice, and Donald Trump in 4 years got to appoint 3. That just feels funny to me. So I'd love to see that system implemented.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Congratulations.
He'll stay after for a few more questions if anybody didn't get to ask during the thing. But anyway, thank you so much. It's been great being your president.